Tonight, I'm going to look at Columbia from 1949 to 1959, and when I was asked to do this, I was a little bit worried. It's very recent history. What was going to happen? What was I going to find? And in looking at Columbia from 1949 to 1959, I found an amazing amount of material. And throughout my presentation tonight, you'll see many events that really shaped Columbia, the city that we live in today. To me, it was a very pivotal period in our history of the 20th century here in town. So we'll take a quick look at what happened over that decade. So greetings from Columbia. I'll set the stage, 1949. The estimated population, according to the city directory, was 27,000 residents of Columbia. In 1950, the actual federal census discovered there were 31,974 residents. Columbia encompassed 6 square miles with 80 miles of road, 75 of those were paved. There were 9,088 telephones in service back then. We had 2 daily newspapers, but no Sunday delivery. There were 3 hotels with 360 rooms, and what I found interesting is they separated the hotels from the 7 tourist courts or motels here in town. We had 3 hospitals, but one was Ellis Fischel, so it wasn't really a full-service hospital, it was a cancer center. 2 highways, Highway 40 and Highway 63. We had 1 airport, 1 roller rink, Empire Rink was here then, 1 bowling alley on East Broadway. There were 8 pool halls, 14 car dealerships with 40 gas stations already, 6 chiropractors, 2 coffee shops, 3 dairies. There was a deli here in town, 6 dressmakers, 4 funeral homes, and sort of a throwback to earlier times, we actually still had a harness and saddle maker here in town in 1949. 2 hat cleaners. There was a massage therapist here in Columbia. We had 1 radio station and 1 potato chip manufacturer. It was the Enberg's Potato Chip at 730 East Highway 40. And we also had 1 trailer park. Here's a map of what Columbia looked like in the 1940s. The west boundary was West Boulevard. To the north, you had Highway 40. To the south was Rollins Road and the University. And to the east, you had Highway 63, which is Old 63 now. So you can see how small Columbia was.
The printing is too small to read, would you?
So 1949 was a very pivotal year. It was this year that the citizens of Columbia decided to go with a council style of government. 1945, the state of Missouri allowed cities with a population of over 10,000 to form their own governments. So in 1949, the citizens voted to have a council style, which consisted of 4 individuals who were elected to represent their voting wards and a mayor, and in turn the council actually would hire a city manager who would oversee the city's plans. That year, March 29th, 1949, Roy Sappington was elected the mayor. The city council was composed of Ray Reed for the 1st ward, Clarence Hartman for the 2nd ward, Clyde Hinshaw for the 3rd ward, and O.K. Johnson from the 4th ward. And of course, the newspaper. They're a great source of history for what happened in town. And we'll see a lot of similarities between the 1940s and 50s and what's happening today in town. Rendleman will take up duties. This is George H. Rendleman from Clarksdale, Mississippi. He'll arrive August 1st to assume the Water and Light Department directorship. His salary is going to be $7,000 a year and the use of a city car. The city is going to name a new dairy inspector. The state of Missouri had come in and inspected the dairies here in town and found them unsatisfactory. The former milk inspector had died the previous year, so they went with this state report. They decided to hire someone to oversee that. And of course, bicycles in the news much today. The chief of police, Chief Hagan, had required all bicyclists in town to license their bicycles by August 1st of 1949. So he was telling people they had a few more weeks to go see him and register. Boone Hospital treated 40 people per day, and actually for the month of June they had 209 people admitted, 26 for major surgery, 70 minor procedures, and they actually had 24 people discharged. And of course, the weather, partly cloudy tonight, high tomorrow of 77, a low of 64. And of course, we have to go to the movies, what was going on in 1949. At the Broadway Drive-In, down on West Broadway now where the shopping center is, where Gerb's is, it was called the Forget the Weather special. You could come in and see Whiplash with Zachary Scott and Alexis Smith. Go downtown to the Varsity Theater and see the Wonderful Urge with Tyrone Power and Gene Tierney, or to go to the Uptown Theater and see Adventures in Baltimore with Robert Young and Shirley Temple. And here's a shot of downtown. This is 900 to 904 East Broadway. And of course, we start to see the development of more suburbs and subdivisions in Columbia. And this is a pretty bad print from the newspaper, but this is October 1949, and the headline reads, "Columbia's Parkade to cost $1 million." And Leslie Proctor was proposing to build a shopping mall and also a neighborhood, and I actually live in Parkade, so this is really interesting for me. But he'd hired Hirsch John, a local architect, to design the Parkade subdivision, and you can sort of see it. This is what he proposed the shopping center to look like. And he mentioned the streets, Leslie, Sandra, and Phyllis were all named for his grandchildren, and those streets are actually here, and I live in Parkade. And it actually explains how Parkade got the name. Hirsch John said they took parking and combined it with arcade to come up with Parkade. And of course, the big question tonight, did Harry Truman actually come to Columbia? Believe it or not, 1950, it's June, he's asked to come and receive an honorary doctor of laws from the University of Missouri and to give a speech to the graduates. And this is a really interesting letter. This is May 31st, 1950, from Thomas Brady, the vice president on campus, to another gentleman talking about Truman arriving and all the different demands from the Secret Service. And so he sort of pokes fun about how the president wants a gavel on the podium. And if you go down to the last paragraph, on the hot dog stand, ring toss, shooting gallery, and merry-go-round, he is neutral. Seems to have no particular objection at present. And there is Harry Truman right there. He's actually in St. Louis. That's June 10th, where he addresses the 35th Infantry Division, their reunion there. And the gentleman behind him clapping his hand, that's Stuart Symington, who was a longtime Missouri senator. And we have to look at Friday, June 9th, 1950, when Truman actually came to town. What happened that day? Rain soaks the crowd greeting Truman. There were actually 1,752 graduates. It was the largest graduating class in the history of the University of Missouri. And they had over 17,000 people in attendance at Memorial Stadium to watch him. They mentioned heavy rain that day at approximately 10:40 a.m. Truman and others were rushed to Jesse Hall to finish. And it mentions in the article, just as President finished speech, the heavens opened upon us. And then Truman remarked as he was leaving the stage, must be a communist in the crowd. And he would also present the ROTC graduates with their officerships and other things. On our way here on the train down Wabash Tracks, he actually walked after lunch and was able to drive the train for a brief time. And then after lunch, they went to Middlebush's house, the president of the university, and he and his sister played a piano duet. And what's really neat, if you want to see what presidents do and what their itineraries look like, here is the commencement exercise and the full itinerary for Truman's visit. 9:15, he arrives at Wabash Railroad Station, where he's greeted by the mayor, the president of the university, and the governor, whisked by the motorcade. And you can see this is an early one, too, all the different changes. You can see 10:35, his conclusion. And all the way at 1:15, the presidential motorcade will depart Jesse for the railroad station. Arrival at the railroad station, and then 1:30 he actually leaves. And he had about 500 or 600 people there wishing him well as he left. And I should also mention, for his piano duet, he and his sister played Mozart's Ninth Sonata and Jerry Lynn's Polka. And he actually left at 1:32, so he was several minutes early. And before I mentioned the developments here in town, and this is a wonderful letter from Sarah Lockwood Williams, who we'll hear a lot from this evening. She moved back to Columbia in 1951. She was a graduate of the University of Missouri and was the widow of Walter Williams, the founder of the University of Missouri Journalism School. But she moves back here in 1951 and she buys a piece of land in the Quarry Heights and builds one of the first homes there. And in this letter to her family, she describes what her brother sees. He lives out on West Rollins, and this is 1951, but he puts, Marvin is so interested in the new house and the entire new subdivision where so many new homes are now being built. He can see many of them from his house, and it makes such a difference to see streets and houses, lights and traffic where only woods and fields have existed until now. And I find it hard to believe that I found a site right in the city where I have all the city facilities and also have such a beautiful view of lakes, bluffs, and woods, and the view will last for no one can obstruct it. And her home was at 408 Edgewood, and they've since changed the addresses, so it's not the exact address anymore. And there is Sarah Lockwood Williams when she lived on Garth, just down the street. And of course, more headlines. I couldn't resist when I was going through the newspapers, but council goes ahead with parking lot. They decide they're going to go ahead and purchase a parking lot. The city council meeting the night before, they voted 4-1 to authorize the city manager to negotiate for parking lot at the southeast corner of 8th and Cherry. O.R. Johnson, who was the 4th Ward representative, was the only one that voted against it, and his quote was, he's not in favor of spending public funds for the benefit of people owning private cars. And 50 years later, we're still hearing about parking. they go on until April 8th, when after the negotiations, the city decides they're not going to authorize this purchase, so they do not buy this parking space at 8th and Cherry. And also something interesting, they authorized the purchase of 20.7 acres, and this turns out to be the first part of Cosmopolitan Park that we'll see later on. Another fun piece of the newspaper was the editorial in the following night's paper, Let's Stop Double Parking, where the editor said they should just remove parking from many of the streets, including Broadway downtown. That would alleviate all the problems. And then he also mentions in his editorial what people need to do is contact the chief of police and tell him to tell his officers to no longer double park on Broadway. And they used to have this really interesting piece called the Traffic Box Score, and it was in the paper for many years, where they kept track of all the traffic violations in town over a 24-hour period. So from March 18th to March 19th, they had 67 violations in a 24-hour period, 0 accidents. They had 29 accidents already for the month of March. The previous March, 1951, they actually had 51 accidents total in town. And for the year of 1952, Columbia had already seen 135 automobile accidents. And here's a letter from the Chamber of Commerce to the City Council asking for support in getting downtown parking to make it easier for the downtown customers and for their businesses. And I found it very interesting, but if you look at number 3 at the bottom, they recommend a lot be purchased instead of leasing property, so that if Columbia ever needs a multi-deck garage in the future, the city would have control of this location. So you can see even 50 years later, we're still talking about parking decks and parking spots. In the 1950s, from 52 to 56, the City of Columbia actually published this neat little book, and it was all the major accomplishments of the City Council from 52 to 56. So I just decided to look at the even years and go through and see some of the fun things that they did. Number 1 was they developed the first code of ordinances in town since 1932. Number 2, they actually initiated airline service between St. Louis and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this was Ozark Airlines. And the airport was where Cosmopolitan Park is today. Number 8 was developing off-site parking for 100 cars, and they actually had a lease with a church on Broadway where they leased the parking lot to rent car spots. And then number 13, they purchased land for the airport and for park expansion, and this was the beginning of Cosmo Park that we saw before. And then the honorable mention for 1952 is July 3rd, they actually installed 24 trash receptacles installed and marked with Keep Columbia Clean. And there's a photo of the Columbia Municipal Airport in the 1950s. And there's an ad from 1959 for Ozark Air, that's servicing 52 Midwest cities in 10 states. And there's the same hangar taken about a week ago. Now it's part of the Parks and Recreation facility out at Cosmopolitan Park. And here's an aerial shot of the airport. This is circa the early 1950s. And you're actually looking south. This is what is Parkside Drive now, and the golf course would be right about here. There's the lake that's on the golf course. And at the top of the screen, you can see the runways here on the left and across the top. And then at the very top of the photo, you can see Highway 40 and also Route E, which becomes Stadium later on. And here's another very interesting shot, and this is taken right about where the interchange for I-70 is now. You can see this is Dexheimer Shelter, and this is a 20 acres purchase for Cosmopolitan Park, and that's dedicated in the summer of 1952. And you can see Highway 40 here in the service road. And what's really interesting, if you look to your right, to the northeast, that's now where Parkade and all the subdivisions are, and you can see just 50 years ago how it was all farmland. And what's really neat too is you can also see how they incorporated the runway into the Cosmopolitan Park design. And thanks to the Boone County Assessor's Office, you can actually see a satellite image of what it looks like today. And you can see all the different changes that have taken place in 50 years, but you can also see the runway features still in the entrance to the park. So back to Sarah Lockwood Williams. This is July 27, 1952. And there are some rumors about things that are happening here in town, things that might increase the population, but she writes in the last paragraph to Family about how the university people are now happy over 2 things: that there's going to be a 4-year medical school here in town. The University of Missouri did not have a 4-year medical school up until the 50s. They had a 2-year program where you would go to medical school for 2 years, then transfer to another university elsewhere. And also, there's a possibility of getting their own television station. So, and then back to campus, this is actually Lowry Street. You can see the Missouri Store Company now, sort of where McDonald's is. And big changes on campus. I mentioned landmarks around town. This is Memorial Union. The tower itself was finished